The Hellfire Battalion, soldiers who entered a burning inferno and never returned. Have you ever heard of soldiers facing something beyond explanation? Something that no one could ever truly understand? You're about to. And trust me, what you'll hear will send chills down your spine. It was 1944. The battlefield was a mess of chaos. Explosions echoed across the barren land as soldiers, brave men, rushed to meet an enemy they couldn't even see. But in the midst of this hellish inferno, something strange happened. There, under the burning skies, a squad of soldiers witnessed something they would never forget. It was a night like no other, and even today, experts can't explain what happened. They heard eerie whispers, saw flickers of strange lights, and something more. At first, they thought it was just exhaustion, or the after effects of the battle. But no, it wasn't. It couldn't be. As the hours passed, their fear grew. Strange shapes darted in the smoke, figures they couldn't explain. And then, the whispers. It wasn't the wind. No, this was different. A low, guttural voice, a voice that didn't belong to any man, echoed from the shadows. The men tried to push it aside. Just ghosts of war, they thought. Nothing more. But the longer they stayed, the more they realized that this battle was different. They weren't just fighting enemies. They were fighting something else. Something ancient. Do you believe in the supernatural? In spirits that haunt the living? Or do you think this is all just a product of tired minds and trauma? One thing's for certain, though. What happened that night, nobody can fully explain it. And those who were there, they never returned. All that remained were stories and the whispers. The squad never had the chance to tell their full story, at least not before they were lost to the firestorm. But one soldier survived. And what he had to say was nothing short of chilling. But here's the catch. He's never spoken a word about the truth, not fully, not until now. What's the real story behind that night? Why did the squad disappear into the flames, leaving behind only fragments of a battle that couldn't have been? This soldier, the last survivor of the battalion, will tell us. He's the key to unlocking the mystery, but beware. This is not a tale for the faint of heart, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Are you ready to dig into the past and uncover the truth? Stay with us, because if you skip ahead, you'll miss something crucial. The mystery only deepens from here. Keep watching, because the Hellfire Battalion is calling, and they want you to know what happened. And, as always, leave a comment. Do you think the supernatural played a role in their disappearance? Or do you have another theory? Let's talk. The night wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. The battle had raged on for hours, but the soldiers couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister had slipped into the chaos. The air was thick, heavy, as if even the atmosphere itself was trying to warn them. And then, it happened. At first, it was just a flicker. No more than a brief, inexplicable flash in the distance. But those who saw it, they knew it wasn't just a trick of the light. It was too deliberate. The flash resembled nothing they'd ever seen on a battlefield before. It didn't make sense. How could there be light out there in the middle of the hellfire when the sky was already choked with smoke and gunfire? The soldiers, one by one, started noticing other signs, strange sounds echoing in the air. It wasn't the typical noise of war, the thunderous booms, the cries of men, the crackle of radio static. No, this was different. A low hum, like a distant song, could be heard on the wind. It didn't belong in the chaos of war. The men couldn't pinpoint where it came from, only that it was there, and it wasn't natural. One of the soldiers, Private Jennings, was the first to speak up. He had been keeping his head down, focused on surviving, until the sounds became impossible to ignore. He turned to his comrades, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you hear that? It's wrong." His words hung in the air, as unsettling as the sound itself. Another soldier, Corporal Miller, dismissed it as nerves. "You're hearing things, Jennings. It's just the wind," he said, but his eyes darted nervously towards the shadows. But it wasn't the wind. No, the strange humming, low and pulsing, grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to vibrate in the very air they breathed. And that wasn't all. In the distance, just beyond the trees, something moved. Something alive. But it wasn't an enemy soldier. It wasn't human. The shadows themselves seemed to bend and twist, forming shapes that weren't quite right. Figures that stood too still, too tall, their movements jerky, unnatural. The soldiers' instincts screamed at them to run, but they couldn't. Something held them there, staring at those shapes that shouldn't have been there. They saw it now. A flicker. A brief moment where the figures seemed to solidify into what could only be described as ghosts. They were soldiers, warriors, from a time long past. Their uniforms were tattered, their faces gaunt with the hollow look of those who had long since left this world. But their eyes were alive. Alive with a hunger, a sorrow, a fire that could not be extinguished. And just as quickly as they appeared, the figures disappeared, vanishing into the smoke and shadows like phantoms slipping through time itself. The men were left speechless, their hearts pounding in their chests. Was it real? Or had they been caught in the haze of their own minds? Private Jennings was the first to speak, his voice shaking. Did anyone else see that? Please tell me. I'm not going crazy." But the looks in their eyes, the wide, terrified expressions, told him that they had all seen it. And then came the second sign. The ground trembled beneath their feet. A low rumble. It wasn't the sound of artillery or bombs exploding. This was something else, something deeper, something that echoed from the very heart of the earth itself. The soldiers turned to each other, exchanging frightened glances. Could this be the prelude to the end of everything? Corporal Miller, who had once dismissed the whispers, now stood frozen. His face had drained of color, his lips trembling. "We need to get out of here, now." But it was too late. The hum grew louder, and a strange, heavy fog began to roll in from the trees. It wasn't the kind of fog that you could escape by walking a few feet. It was everywhere. It surrounded them, choking out the dim glow of their lanterns, leaving them with nothing but an impenetrable shroud of smoke and the sound of their own breath. As the fog thickened, the soldiers felt something new, a cold, unnatural chill that began creeping into their bones. It was the kind of cold you couldn't shake, no matter how hard you tried. The kind of cold that wasn't from the weather, but from something deeper, something that made your skin crawl. The whispers started again, but this time, they weren't coming from the wind. No, this time the voices were closer. Too close. "Get down!" shouted Sergeant Hall, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening sound of footsteps in the fog. Footsteps. But no one was there. Then, another flash. A bright, searing light, like lightning, but without the storm. It cracked through the fog like a blade, and for a brief moment the figures in the mist became visible once more. They weren't just ghosts anymore. They were living memories. Soldiers who had fought in battles long past, their faces twisted in anger, in grief, in eternal unrest. This wasn't just a trick of the light. No, these were souls, caught between worlds, unable to find peace. As quickly as it came, the light vanished. The fog thickened again, and the whispers continued, as if urging them forward towards something they couldn't comprehend. But what happened next was even more terrifying. One of the men, Private Cole disappeared. Vanished into the fog without a sound, without a trace, just like that. No one saw it happen, but one moment, Cole was there, and the next, he was gone. No one spoke for a moment, the silence hanging heavy in the air. The men were too frightened to move, too shaken to speak. Had they just witnessed a ghostly army from the past? Had the war become more than just a battle of soldiers? Or was something far more sinister at play? As the fog swirled around them, the only thing they could do was wait, and hope that whatever haunted them didn't return. But the question remained. What was out there, and why did it want them? Keep watching, because the answer lies just ahead. The truth is coming, and you don't want to miss it. The silence after Private Cole's disappearance felt like it would swallow them whole. The fog still clung to the trees, the echoes of the strange whispers reverberating in their ears. No one spoke at first. How could they? They had all seen it. They had all felt it, the supernatural force that had infiltrated their war zone. But the terrifying thing was that no one could explain what had happened to Cole. He hadn't been taken by enemy fire. No explosions had rocked the earth beneath his feet. He hadn't even screamed. He had simply vanished. But there was one man who knew the truth. Private Jennings, who had first noticed the strange humming, was the only one left who could piece together what was happening. But he had his own reasons for holding back. What he had witnessed that night was not something easily shared, not something a person could simply speak of without inviting ridicule. As the remaining soldiers huddled in fear, Jennings quietly moved to the edge of their makeshift camp. His breath was shallow, his hands shaking. But it wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something that twisted in his gut, something he had carried with him since that fateful night. He had always been a quiet man, never one to share his thoughts easily. But tonight was different. Tonight, the truth demanded to be heard. He could feel it. Turning to the men gathered around the campfire, Jennings finally spoke. His voice was low, almost imperceptible above the wind, but the weight of his words settled on the group like a heavy shroud. I know what happened to Cole. His words sent a shiver through the soldiers, but no one dared interrupt him. They had seen the look in his eyes, the same look they all had before they saw the ghosts in the mist, before they heard the eerie hum in the air. I know because I saw it too. Jennings paused, his words hanging in the air like smoke, as if he were weighing the decision to reveal the nightmare he had experienced. What do you mean, you saw it? Asked Sergeant Hall, his voice hoarse from the tension. What happened to Cole? Jennings looked around, making sure no one else was listening. He had to be careful. He had to be certain. He leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper now. There's something in that fog. Something old. Something that's been waiting. His eyes darted, a flicker of fear crossing his face before he continued. It's like they were stuck, trapped between life and death, and Cole didn't just disappear. He was pulled into it, into the fog, into the past. The soldiers stared at him, their faces pale with disbelief. But Jennings wasn't finished. He knew he had to explain, or the fear would consume them all. It's not just ghosts, it's not just spirits of soldiers who died here. This is something older than all of us. Jennings' voice faltered as he spoke, but the words seemed to take on a life of their own. The battalion, the Hellfire Battalion, we're not the first to fight here, not by a long shot. This land, it's cursed. And what we're seeing, what we're experiencing, it's something else, something that never died. His words hung in the air, thick with a terrible truth. The other men looked around, uneasily shifting their weight as though the shadows themselves were closing in. They had all heard whispers of the past, the strange happenings, the eerie disappearances, but no one had dared to speak of them. Until now. Jennings swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. I don't know how to explain it, but I'll tell you this. That night, we weren't just fighting the enemy, we were fighting something else, something from beyond, and it's still out there. His eyes flickered toward the mist again, as though he could see it swirling in the distance, waiting, watching. The soldiers looked at one another, their expressions uncertain. They had been through hell, fought real enemies, lost comrades. But this was something they didn't know how to fight. Jennings, Sergeant Hall said after a long pause. If this is true, if what you're saying is real, then we need to get out of here. We need to get back to base and report it. We need help. Jennings shook his head, his face darkening. Number, we can't leave. Not yet. We have to finish this. If we leave now, whatever it is, it will follow us. It's already too late for us. It's been waiting for us. For me. The other soldiers stared at him, confused, fearful. But Jennings was resolute. The truth had finally surfaced, and there was no turning back now. He had seen something in the mist that night, something so powerful, so terrifying, that he knew their survival depended on one thing: confronting it. Jennings fell silent, his thoughts racing. In his mind's eye, he was back there, back in the heart of the battlefield, standing at the edge of the fog. He could still see them, the shadows, the twisted soldiers, those who were long dead but still alive in a way that made his skin crawl. He wasn't the first to face this. He had seen their faces in the mist, men who had fought here long ago, warriors from different times, different wars. And now, they were here again. They weren't just haunting the battleground. They were trapped, just like the men who had fought with him. Trapped by a curse that stretched back centuries, a curse that had never been broken. Jennings shook his head, trying to push the memories away. But they clung to him, tighter with every passing second. He was the only one left who could make sense of it all. But why had he survived? Why had he, and not Cole? And if the battalion had been fighting something from beyond, death itself, how could they ever hope to stop it? Whatever's out there, it's not just waiting for us, Jennings murmured, almost to himself. It's waiting for the right moment, to finish what it started. A cold wind blew through the trees, and for a brief moment Jennings thought he heard the faintest whisper on the breeze. It wasn't the wind. It was the voices of the past, calling, urging him to follow them. Stay close, Jennings warned. Whatever happens, don't stray from the group. We don't know what this thing wants, but we'll find out. With that, the men huddled together, fear and uncertainty gnawing at their every step. And somewhere out there, in the shadows, something stirred. The Hellfire Battalion was not finished yet. The air was thick with unease. Every rustle of the leaves, every crack of a twig seemed amplified in the dense silence that enveloped them. The men huddled close around their dwindling campfire, eyes darting nervously between the shadows. The fog, now a suffocating blanket around them, had not lifted. If anything, it seemed to press closer, darker, more oppressive than before. Jennings couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The hairs on the back of his neck stood at attention, his pulse quickening. He tried to steady his breath, but it felt as though the air itself was being sucked out of his lungs. Jennings, Sergeant Hall's voice was tense, low, but his words were laced with fear. You said we're not alone out here. That thing, what exactly are we dealing with? Jennings looked at the ground for a long moment. He didn't want to say it, didn't want to believe it himself. But there was no turning back now. They were all trapped in this nightmare together, and the only way out was through it. "I don't know exactly what it is," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I know one thing. It's not a ghost, not just the spirits of the past. It's something older, something alive. And it's waiting for us to make a mistake." The air seemed to thicken with tension, a weight pressing down on their shoulders as they waited for the next sign, whatever it was. Something was coming. They could feel it. And then, it happened. A strange noise broke the silence, low, guttural, like something growling in the distance. But there was no animal out there. There couldn't be. They were in the heart of the battlefield, far from any natural life. Corporal Miller, his eyes wide with fear, was the first to react. "Did you hear that?" His voice was shaky. "What the hell was that?" Before anyone could respond, a sudden blast of wind whipped through the trees, snapping branches and sending the smoke spiraling in unnatural patterns. For a moment, it felt as though the very air itself was alive, twisting, pulling at them like an unseen hand. The fire sputtered and flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the men's faces. "What is going on?" Private Harrison stammered, his eyes darting nervously toward the trees. "What the hell is out there?" A shadow moved at the edge of the campfire's light. A quick flicker of movement, too fast to be anything natural. The soldiers froze, their eyes trained on the spot, hearts pounding in their chests. And then, whatever it was, appeared. A figure, tall and gaunt, stepped out from the darkness. It wasn't a soldier. It wasn't human. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, they were black, soulless pits, sucking in the light like hungry voids. The air around it seemed to warp, twisting like heat rising from a desert floor. It stood there, motionless, watching them with a gaze that seemed to pierce through their very souls. The soldiers couldn't move. They couldn't breathe. Is it one of them?" Miller whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. Jennings had seen it before. He'd seen it all. He had known it was coming. This thing was no ghost, no spirit. It was something else, something that had followed them from the depths of the fog. Something that was feeding off their fear, their confusion, their very essence. Before anyone could react, the creature vanished, flickered, into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. Silence. "Did anyone else see that?" Private Walker whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Don't even try to make sense of it," Jennings said quickly, his voice urgent. "It's not something we can fight. Whatever it is, it's beyond us." They were all frozen, hearts pounding. Their breaths were shallow, their bodies rigid with fear. The figure had been there, but now it was gone. Vanished without a trace. There was no sign of it in the shadows, no disturbance in the fog. It was as though it had never been there at all. But the fear lingered. And so did the questions. "What do we do now?" Hall asked quietly. "We can't keep going on like this. Something's hunting us, and I don't think we can outrun it." Jennings took a long, shuddering breath. His hands were trembling, but he couldn't let the others see it. He had to remain the rock, the one who knew. "The fog, it's not just covering us," he murmured, almost to himself. "It's feeding on us. It's pulling us into it, deeper and deeper until we can't escape. Whatever it is, it's feeding off the fear, the confusion, and we've been trapped." "Trapped?" Miller repeated. "You mean we're—" "No!" Jennings snapped. "Not if we fight it. We have to stick together. We have to find a way to destroy it. We can't let it take us one by one." But just as he said those words, another noise cut through the air. A harsh, bone-chilling screech. A sound so unnatural it made their blood run cold. and then the fog shifted. For a brief moment, the wind died down, and everything was still. Too still. The soldiers' eyes darted toward the trees, searching, waiting for something, anything, to break the suffocating quiet. And that's when they saw it. A flicker of light, just beyond the fog. Faint at first, like a distant star in a storm, but it grew brighter, closer. A strange, unnatural light that seemed to pulse with an energy all its own. It wasn't from the flames of the battle. It wasn't from their lanterns or rifles. It was something else, something old. Jennings could feel his heart racing. He didn't want to turn around. He didn't want to look. But he had to. He had no choice. The light came closer, its unnatural glow illuminating the fog in a sickly green hue. The soldiers were paralyzed, their minds unable to process what was happening. Their bodies screamed to run, but they couldn't. They were rooted in place by something invisible, something far stronger than their will to survive. And then the light revealed its true form. A figure stepped out of the glow, tall and imposing, clad in tattered armor. The figure raised its head, its eyes shining with a malevolent light, and the men, the soldiers, realized that they weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were facing something ancient, something that had come back to life, something that would not rest until it had claimed them all. "Get ready," Jennings whispered, his voice trembling with a fear he couldn't hide. "It's not over. Not yet." But just as the figure moved towards them, the ground beneath their feet rumbled, the earth trembled, as if the very fabric of time was being torn apart. The creature stopped, its form flickering, its unnatural light dimming. Something else, someone else, was coming. The real question was, who? The ground trembled beneath their feet once again, but this time it wasn't just the unnatural rumbles of the earth shaking with malevolent energy. It was the deep, bone-chilling sense that something was stirring, something vast and ancient, waiting just beyond their reach. The soldiers stood frozen, their hearts racing, as the figure in the green glow flickered before them. The once imposing warrior, now reduced to a shadow in the mist, began to disintegrate before their eyes. It was as though the very air was rejecting it, pulling the figure apart, unraveling it like a memory long forgotten. It was then that they realized this wasn't just a spirit. It was something older, something tied to this land in ways they couldn't yet understand. Jennings felt the weight of the moment. His mind raced, pulling him back to a time long before the war, before the battlefields, before everything they thought they knew. He had been trying to ignore it, trying to focus on surviving, but now there was no turning back. He had to tell them. They needed to know what had happened here long before they ever stepped foot onto this cursed soil. "It's not just the war," Jennings muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The soldiers, still caught in a daze, turned toward him, uncertainty clouding their faces. "What's happening here? What we've seen, it's all connected. Connected to something before." "Before," Hall echoed, trying to comprehend what Jennings was implying. Jennings nodded, his eyes distant. "This battalion, this Hellfire Battalion, it was formed for a reason that goes beyond anything we've been told. And whatever's out there, whatever's hunting us, has been waiting for us, waiting for me." The men exchanged nervous glances, each one wondering if they were hearing this right. Hall stepped forward, his face drawn with worry. "Jennings, what do you mean, waiting for you? You're saying this has been planned?" Jennings hesitated, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. It wasn't just a random battle. It wasn't just us, just soldiers caught in the chaos of war. This place, this land, it's been cursed for centuries. And I think the Hellfire Battalion, our battalion, was created to do something about it, to contain something. Contain what? Private Harrison asked, his voice trembling. What are you talking about? Jennings looked towards the fog again, the mist swirling, moving unnaturally, and his gaze darkened. The soldiers, the ones we've seen, the ones who appeared in the fog, they're part of this, part of the land's curse. They were soldiers who fought here long ago, but they never left. They didn't die in battle, not really. They're trapped? Jennings turned to Hall, his eyes hard with the memory of something he couldn't forget. I've seen their faces before. Not just the soldiers from the past. I've seen them in my dreams, in my memories, since the very first day we stepped foot on this cursed ground. It's like the land calls to them. It calls to me. Private Walker stepped back, clearly disturbed by what he was hearing. So what? You're telling us we're fighting the ghosts of the past? Dead men from another time? Jennings shook his head slowly. It's more than that. They're not dead, not in the way you think. They're stuck between worlds, prisoners of something older than death. And they're waiting for the battalion to come, waiting for me. There was a long, heavy silence as the soldiers processed his words. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers, the same low, eerie hum they had all heard before. Why are they waiting for you? Hall finally asked, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Jennings took a deep breath, steeling himself for the truth he had kept buried for so long. It goes back to a prophecy, he said, his voice barely audible. A prophecy about the Hellfire Battalion, about men who would enter this land and never return. It was never supposed to happen, but somehow it did. Somehow I, was meant to be here. The battalion was created to keep the curse at bay, but we've failed. The land has awakened again. And whatever we're facing now, whatever those soldiers in the mist are, it's been waiting for us to make a mistake. The words hung in the air, each one carrying the weight of an ancient curse, one that no soldier, no matter how brave, could escape. What is this prophecy, Jennings? Hall asked, his voice sharp now. What does it say? Jennings sighed heavily, his eyes haunted. It's not just a prophecy. It's a warning that we were never supposed to step foot here, that the battalion was supposed to keep the land contained, to guard it. But the war, it broke us. It broke everything. And now we're paying the price. The prophecy says that when the Hellfire Battalion fails, when the curse is no longer contained, the souls of the past will rise again. The dead will return, and they will claim those who dared disturb their resting place. The soldiers looked around, the weight of Jennings's words sinking in. The mist seemed to grow thicker around them, pressing down on them like a weight they couldn't escape. Are you saying we're part of this prophecy? Miller asked, his voice quivering. Jennings nodded slowly. Yes, we're the last of the Hellfire Battalion. And whatever it is, whatever we're facing, we're the ones who have to stop it. We're the last line of defense. But I don't know if we can. Just then, a loud crack sounded from the trees, and the fog shifted again, a deep, rumbling growl reverberating through the air. The soldiers turned, eyes wide with panic. A figure appeared in the distance, tall, armored, and alive, but not living. A figure from the past, its dark eyes glowing in the mist. Jennings's voice dropped to a whisper, fear creeping into his words. It's here. The time has come. The soldiers backed away slowly, terror creeping up their spines. They had been warned, but now there was no turning back. Whatever they were facing, whatever was hunting them, it was no longer just a memory. The past had returned. And this time, it wasn't leaving. The air was still, too still. The oppressive fog that surrounded them had thickened into an impenetrable wall, blocking out any remaining glimmer of light. For a moment there was no sound. Nothing but the hurried, shallow breaths of the soldiers, their hearts pounding in their chests. But then, that all-too-familiar growl echoed through the trees again. Jennings, his eyes scanning the edges of the camp, didn't need to say a word. The soldiers had heard it too, the deep, guttural sound that had become a part of their nightmares. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't some animal. This was something else. And it was getting closer. "What the hell is that?" Private Harrison whispered, his voice trembling as he looked desperately toward Jennings, seeking some explanation. Jennings didn't answer immediately. He knew what it was. He had felt it before, seen it in his dreams, in the fog. That thing, that presence from beyond the veil of the living and the dead, was getting closer. "It's coming," Jennings muttered, "and this time it's not just an apparition, it's real." The air grew colder, so cold that their breath misted in the air, even though it wasn't that late in the evening. The temperature was dropping rapidly, like a storm front had moved in, but the eerie stillness of the fog made it feel unnatural. Wrong. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The world wasn't supposed to feel this quiet, this suffocating. And then, out of the fog, something moved. At first it was a figure, nothing more than a silhouette against the dense mist. But as it drew closer, its shape became clearer. It was a man. Or at least it looked like a man, if one could call it that. His body was emaciated, skin stretched tight over bones, a face that seemed half decayed, eyes hollow and empty, but with a burning intensity. This figure was no ghost. It wasn't an illusion. It was something. Someone. From the past. One of the lost soldiers who had been trapped here. Trapped in this endless cycle of death and decay. The soldiers froze, every muscle in their bodies tensing in fear as they watched the figure step slowly into the firelight. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, vanishing back into the fog like a specter. The men stood there, motionless, their breath catching in their throats. Was it real? Was it something they had imagined? Did anyone else see that? Walker asked, his voice weak, his eyes darting to each of the others. "Yeah, we saw it," Hall snapped, his voice shaky. "We saw that, but what the hell was it?" Jennings' eyes narrowed, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "It wasn't just a soldier," he said, his voice a low growl. "That was one of them, one of the lost battalion members. A man who fought here long ago, but he didn't die in battle. He got trapped here. Trapped in the fog." "The fog?" Harrison repeated, his voice full of disbelief. "You mean to say these are ghosts? Spirits of soldiers who died here?" Jennings shook his head slowly. "Number, these aren't just ghosts. These are lost souls, cursed, doomed to walk this land over and over for eternity. They're not dead, not in the way we think. They're caught between worlds, and now they're coming for us. For me." The tension in the group was palpable. No one spoke. No one dared to move. They were all too afraid of what would come next. Suddenly, there was another noise, a low scratching sound from the trees. The soldiers spun around, weapons raised, scanning the dark silhouettes of the trees. But there was nothing. Just the swaying branches, the silent fog. And then came another. This time it was more distinct. A rhythmic tapping, like a footstep, dragging across the ground, uneven and slow. But it wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from beneath them. "Jesus Christ," Miller muttered, his voice shaking. "Is it coming from the ground?" The tapping grew louder, more frantic, almost as if whatever was underneath them was getting closer, desperately trying to reach the surface. The men took several steps back, forming a tight, defensive circle. No one knew where the danger was coming from. They could feel the ground vibrating beneath them, but no one wanted to voice their fear. And then it happened. A massive crack split the earth beneath their feet, the sound echoing through the night air, deep and hollow. It was as if the land itself had split open, revealing something dark, something ancient, something waiting. Out of the crack in the earth, something began to rise. At first it was just a shadow, barely visible in the thick fog. But then it grew. Slowly, methodically. The figure was tall, its body cloaked in a tattered, ragged uniform that was torn at the edges. The form moved unnaturally, like a puppet being dragged from the depths. And as it stepped into the firelight, they could see it more clearly. A soldier, but not just any soldier. This one was different. Its skin was a sickly greenish hue, and its eyes were wide, vacant, lifeless. It wasn't alive, but it wasn't truly dead either. The creature stood motionless, staring at the men with eyes that burned with an unquenchable hunger. There was no sound, no movement, but the air around them seemed to crackle with energy, like something ancient was stirring beneath the surface. "What the hell is that thing?" Walker gasped, backing away. Jennings stepped forward, his expression grim. "It's one of them. One of the soldiers from the battalion. A man who died here, and who is now bound to this place. This is what we've been fighting." "Fighting?" Hall echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. "How the hell are we supposed to fight that?" Jennings took a deep breath, his hands trembling, but his voice was steady. "We're not supposed to fight it. We just need to survive long enough to make it out of here. We need to find a way to break the curse." "But how?" Miller asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do we even begin to stop something like that?" Jennings hesitated. "I don't know yet, but I will. I've seen it before. I know how to end it. But we need to move. We can't stay here." The creature's eyes flickered, its head tilting to one side as if studying them, and then, without warning, it disappeared. The fog seemed to swallow it whole, leaving the men in stunned silence. For a long time, no one moved. No one spoke. And then, from the shadows came that haunting, familiar sound, the low hum, the whispers of soldiers long gone. "Get ready," Jennings whispered. "It's not over yet." The fog didn't let up. It was as if the land itself had become a living thing, wrapping its tendrils around them, suffocating them, drawing them deeper into its grip. The soldiers, their nerves frayed to the breaking point, huddled together, trying to make sense of the events that had unfolded around them. The creature, the strange figures from the past, the whispers. It was all becoming too much. "Jennings," Sergeant Hall said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and fear. "We can't just keep running from this. We need answers. We need something we can fight." Jennings looked away, his eyes distant. He knew they were right. They had been stumbling in the dark for too long, but every time he thought he was close to understanding what was really going on, another layer of the mystery would reveal itself, only to complicate everything further. The truth, if it even existed, was slipping through his fingers like smoke. "I know," Jennings muttered, his voice low and strained. "I know, but the more I think about it, the more I realize that the answer might not be something we can just find. It's something we have to understand, and that means digging deeper into the past, into the curse that's bound this land." "Past?" Miller asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you talking about? We've been fighting ghosts and monsters for days, and now you want to dig into the past? What the hell does that even mean?" Jennings shook his head. "It means there's something here, something ancient, something that's been buried for centuries. And the Hellfire Battalion, it wasn't just a military unit. It was a last-ditch effort to contain something that had been unleashed, something we don't even fully understand." The soldiers exchanged wary glances. the weight of Jennings's words sinking in. They had been thrown into this nightmare without warning, without any idea of what they were truly up against. And now Jennings was talking about things that didn't make sense, things that had nothing to do with the war they were supposed to be fighting. "What's buried here?" Hall demanded, his voice sharp with impatience. "What are we dealing with?" Jennings took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to find the words. "The land we're standing on, it's not just a battlefield, it's a site of something far darker. The curse doesn't come from the war, it's older, far older. And whatever happened here all those years ago, whatever was unleashed, it's still here. And we're the ones who are going to have to deal with it." "What are you saying?" Walker asked, his voice trembling. "That the Hellfire Battalion was sent here to contain something? What could we possibly be dealing with?" Jennings looked them all in the eye, his expression grave. "I don't have all the answers yet, but I do know this. The soldiers we've seen, the ones who appear out of the fog, they aren't just the spirits of men who died here. They're the remnants of something that should have been contained, some kind of ancient force, something far beyond anything we've ever fought before. And the Hellfire Battalion, it was created to stop it, to keep it from getting out." A heavy silence fell over the group. The realization of what Jennings was suggesting hung in the air, thick and oppressive. "So what now?" Hall asked finally, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and desperation. "What are we supposed to do? We've seen what's out there. We've heard the whispers. How the hell do we fight something like that?" Jennings's jaw tightened. "We need to find out what happened here. What really happened. We need to find the source of this curse, the thing that the battalion was created to contain, and I think I know where to look." The soldiers turned toward him, their expressions a mixture of hope and dread. They had been through hell. They had seen things no one should ever have to see. But if there was any chance to escape this nightmare, to find a way to stop whatever had been awakened, they had to take it. Jennings led them towards the remains of the old fort. It had been abandoned long before the war, a decaying monument to something that had once stood tall and proud. Now it was little more than crumbling walls and broken stone, swallowed by the ever-encroaching fog. "This is where it began," Jennings said quietly as they approached the entrance. "This is where the Hellfire Battalion was born." The soldiers hesitated for a moment, their fear rising again as they looked at the ruin before them. But they had no choice. The answers, the truth, were inside. Inside the fort, the air was thick with dust, the silence suffocating. As they made their way through the crumbling hallways, Jennings stopped in front of a long-forgotten doorway, the wood rotting away, barely holding together. He reached forward and pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark, but as the soldiers stepped forward, their boots crunching against the floor, they saw it. A large wooden chest, ancient and worn with age. The metal bands that held it together were rusted, but the markings on the surface were still visible. "This is it," Jennings whispered. "This is what we've been looking for." He knelt down and carefully opened the chest. Inside, there were papers, old maps, and what appeared to be a collection of journals. Jennings carefully picked up one of the journals, his hands trembling as he flipped it open. The writing inside was faded, but still legible. It was a soldier's account, dated from the early 1800s. Jennings read aloud, his voice growing, more strained with each word. The battalion was formed not to fight in the war, but to contain an ancient force that had been awakened by the trespasses of man. The land we stand on is cursed, this we know. The soldiers we fight are not our enemies. They are the victims of an evil that has taken root here, and they too are doomed to serve it. Jennings paused, his heart racing. The word sent a chill down his spine. The key to stopping it lies within the fort. Only those with the strength to face the darkness can hope to end it. But beware, once the curse is awakened, there is no turning back. The last words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. The curse, it's been waiting, Jennings whispered, his face pale. And we've just made it stronger. The realization hit them all at once. The soldiers hadn't been sent here to fight a war. They had been sent to stop an ancient evil that had been sealed away, hidden beneath the land. And now, the seal had been broken. The curse had been unleashed. And they were the ones who had to stop it, before it was too late. The room was eerily quiet, the air thick with the weight of what they had just discovered. The journal, its pages yellowed with age, was now spread out before them, revealing a grim history that none of them could have anticipated. Jennings's fingers trembled as he turned the page, his eyes scanning the words that seemed to unravel the very fabric of reality they were facing. The curse, the evil force tied to the land, wasn't just a story. It was real. The Hellfire Battalion hadn't been a conventional military unit. They hadn't been sent here to fight for any flag or country. They had been sent here to contain something, to keep it from escaping the dark corners of the earth. Does anyone else feel like we're digging our own graves? Miller's voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon whatever horrors were lurking just outside the walls. Jennings didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the journal, his mind racing to piece together the fragments of this dark puzzle. The journal spoke of rituals, strange, ancient rituals that had been performed to seal something deep within the land. The more he read, the more the realization struck him. They hadn't just stumbled into a battlefield. They had unknowingly stepped into a tomb, a place where an ancient evil had been locked away, waiting for the right moment to break free. Jennings, what does it say? Hall asked, his voice tight with anxiety. What do we do now? Jennings finally looked up, his eyes burning with determination, but there was a flicker of fear behind them. We need to find the rest of it, he said, his voice low, almost urgent. There's more to this. A lot more. What do you mean? Walker asked, his face pale with worry. You think there's more of these journals? More clues hidden around here? Jennings nodded, the weight of the situation settling over him like a thick fog. Yes. This journal. It's only part of the picture, but it's clear. Whatever is trapped here, whatever this evil force is, it's tied to this fort. And the Hellfire Battalion was meant to stop it by finding the key, but we've made it worse. Every step we take, we're waking it up. The words hung in the air, each one heavier than the last. The soldiers looked around at the decaying walls of the fort, as if expecting the shadows to shift and reveal something lurking just out of sight. We can't just sit here, Hall said, his tone laced with a desperation that was growing by the second. We need to find the rest of this evidence, whatever it is. We need to understand what the Hellfire Battalion was really protecting. Jennings stood up, his face set in grim determination. There's an old archive room deeper in the fort. I think it's hidden, behind a locked door. If we can find it, we might uncover more details, more answers. Then what are we waiting for? Miller's voice was shaky, but his resolve was clear. Let's go. The longer we stay here, the more we're tempting whatever's out there to finish the job. The group moved quickly, the sounds of their boots echoing in the hollow silence of the fort. The walls seemed to close in on them as they moved deeper into the darkness, their flashlights casting long, dancing shadows that only served to heighten the growing sense of dread. Jennings led the way, knowing exactly where they needed to go, but feeling the weight of the journey ahead. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into the heart of the beast itself, that the deeper they went, the more they would awaken. As they approached the far end of the fort, The air grew colder, unnaturally so. Each breath they took came out in a visible mist, the chill settling deep into their bones. They reached a thick wooden door, its surface cracked and weathered with age, a heavy lock hanging on it, rusted and old. "This is it," Jennings whispered. "The archive room. It's been sealed for a reason." He reached for the lock, the sound of his fingers grazing the cold metal sending a shiver through the group. The air felt wrong. It was as if something evil, was aware of their presence. The hairs on the back of their necks stood on end as they waited for something to happen. Jennings pulled the lock open with a loud click, and the door creaked open slowly, revealing the dimly lit room beyond. Dust hung in the air, thick and undisturbed, as though it had been waiting for them. As they stepped into the room, the stench of decay hit them, old paper, mold, and something darker. The room was filled with rows of shelves stacked with old crates, maps, and papers. Everything was aged and fragile, but there was a sense of foreboding that made it feel like they were intruding on something that had been hidden for far too long. "What are we looking for, Jennings?" Hall asked, his voice barely more than a breath. "Anything that can explain what the hell is going on here?" Jennings nodded. "We need to find something that will tell us about the ritual, the one that was supposed to seal the evil away. It's the only way we'll know how to stop it." They scattered across the room, pulling open drawers and flipping through old papers, trying to make sense of the madness that had been left behind. Time was running out. They could feel it. Every second they spent in this room was a second closer to whatever force was lurking just outside the walls. And then, Walker let out a strangled gasp. "Jennings!" he shouted, holding up a faded map that was yellowed with age. It was a map of the fort, but there was something more. There were markings on it, symbols that looked like they had been drawn by hand, etched into the page with a sharp, deliberate motion. Jennings took the map from him, his heart pounding as he studied it. The symbols were strange, incomprehensible, almost as if they were part of a language that had long been forgotten. But one thing was certain. These markings weren't just random. They formed a pattern that matched something he had seen in the journal earlier. "This is it," Jennings whispered. "This is the key, the ritual. It wasn't just about stopping the evil. It was about binding it. There's a place in the fort, a place where they performed the ritual. If we can get there, we might have a chance to stop it." The map showed a hidden passage, one that led deep into the ground, far deeper than the fort's surface. It was marked with the same strange symbols, as if the very earth itself had been carved to hold this force in place. "Let's go," Jennings said, his voice full of resolve. "We don't have much time." The soldiers gathered around him, the weight of their decision pressing down on them like a leaden weight. They had found the evidence they needed, but it had only led to more questions, more danger. Now they had no choice but to follow the path laid out before them, to confront the evil that had been sealed away for centuries, and to face whatever lay in the darkness beneath. The map was in their hands now, a fragile piece of history leading them to the deepest, darkest corners of the fort. The soldiers moved with urgency, their every step echoing through the narrow, crumbling hallways as they followed Jennings to the hidden passage beneath the ground. The atmosphere in the fort had changed. It was no longer just a place filled with decay. It was a place filled with waiting dread. Something was stirring beneath the earth. Something ancient. Something that had been sleeping, but was now awakening. Jennings led them to a stone door, its surface covered in strange symbols, the same ones from the journal and the map. The air around it was thick, heavy, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Jennings pushed against the door, and with a deep groan, It slowly creaked open. "What's in there, Jennings?" Hall asked, his voice tight with fear, as the darkness beyond seemed to swallow the light of their flashlights. Jennings took a step forward, his face grim. "We need to see it for ourselves. Whatever was sealed down here, it's the key to everything." As they descended into the depths, the temperature dropped even further. The air felt damp and suffocating, each breath harder to take, as though the earth itself didn't want them there. Their flashlights flickered, casting strange, warped shadows along the jagged stone walls. The passage was narrow, forcing them to move single file, and the further they went, the more the feeling of unease intensified. With each step, they could hear a strange sound, like a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, but growing louder as they moved. The words were unintelligible, just murmurs of something old, something that had been trapped down here for longer than any of them could imagine. "What is that?" Walker asked, his voice trembling. "Don't listen to it," Jennings said, his tone sharp. "It's trying to get inside your head. Stay focused." But the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to be growing stronger. The walls around them seemed to pulse with the sound, as if the passage itself was alive. And then, as they rounded a corner, they saw it. A massive chamber stretched before them, the walls lined with stone carvings, the floor covered in dust and broken pieces of old relics. In the center of the room, a large stone altar stood, its surface slick with some dark, unknown substance that shimmered faintly in the dim light. At the base of the altar, etched into the stone, were more symbols, more of the same markings that had appeared on the map. "This is it," Jennings whispered. "This is where it happened." As they stepped into the room, the temperature plummeted, the air becoming thick with a tangible sense of dread. And that's when they saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the far corner of the room. At first they thought it was just another shadow, but as their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they realized it was something far worse. A soldier. Or at least, what had once been a soldier. Its uniform was tattered, its face gaunt and hollow, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The air around it seemed to distort, a ripple of heat, a distortion of reality, as though the very space it occupied was being bent. "What the hell?" Hall gasped, his voice barely a whisper. Jennings stepped forward, his heart hammering in his chest. He recognized the soldier. It was one of them, one of the lost souls trapped here by the curse. But this one was different. It wasn't just a ghost. It was something more, something darker. The soldier's head slowly turned to face them, its eyes locked onto Jennings. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The whispers, the hum in the air became deafening, and then, with a sudden movement, the figure lunged toward them. "Get back!" Jennings shouted, but it was too late. The soldier moved faster than any human could, its arms reaching out to grab hold of Jennings. But before it could make contact, the room itself seemed to react. The walls vibrated with a deep, resonant sound, and a crackling energy filled the air. The soldier's form began to flicker, its body distorting and bending as though caught between two worlds. "No!" Jennings screamed, his voice filled with desperation. "Not again! This isn't the way!" With a sudden burst of force, the soldier's form imploded, vanishing into thin air as the room fell silent. The energy in the air dissipated, leaving only the faint hum of the whispers. The soldiers stood frozen, unable to speak, their minds racing to process what had just happened. Had they truly seen it? Had the soldier actually attacked them? "That wasn't just a ghost," Hall finally managed to say, his voice trembling. "That thing, it attacked us." Jennings's face was pale, his breath shallow. "No, it wasn't a ghost. That was a soldier who never died. He's been stuck here like the others, trapped by the curse. He was a part of the battalion that failed to stop whatever it is that's buried here. Private Harrison stepped forward, his hands shaking. What the hell is buried here, Jennings? What did the Hellfire Battalion fail to stop? Jennings looked at them all, his expression grim. It's not just a curse. It's not just an evil force. Whatever's down here, it's an ancient entity. It's been trapped beneath the earth for centuries, and the Hellfire Battalion was sent to contain it. But now it's awake. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows shifting in the corners of their vision. And as they stood there, processing the weight of Jennings's words, the whispers grew louder. And then the hum returned, deep, resonant, vibrating through their very bones. The soldier wasn't the only one here. Something else, something far darker, was watching them. Jennings's eyes widened as he stepped back, his heart racing. It's not over. It's only just begun. Before they could react, the stone altar at the center of the room began to glow, the symbols etched into the stone pulsing with a sickly light. Something was rising, something was coming to life, and whatever it was, they had just unleashed it. The walls around them shook violently, and the floor beneath their feet cracked open, a deep rumbling sound filling the chamber as the very earth groaned under the weight of whatever was awakening. "Move!" Jennings shouted, but it was too late. The ground split, wide open, and from the depths something huge began to emerge, a shadowy figure, its form indistinct but massive, its presence suffocating. It was like the land itself was giving birth to the darkness. The creature, the ancient evil, had finally been freed. And it was hungry. The room trembled beneath their feet. The air was thick with an oppressive heat, a foul stench rising from the cracks in the ground as the creature emerged from the depths. The once still chamber now seemed alive, the walls and floor shaking violently as if something massive was clawing its way to the surface, pushing against the very earth that had held it captive for centuries. Jennings's heart raced in his chest. He knew this moment had been coming, but now that it was here, nothing could have prepared him for what they were facing. The creature, if it could even be called that, was not just an entity from the depths of history. It was a force, a being older than time itself, something that had been sealed away by the first Hellfire Battalion, and now it had been unleashed. "Run!" Jennings shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to get out, now!" The soldiers barely had time to react. The ground split open wider, jagged cracks sprawling outwards like the fingers of some monstrous hand reaching up from the earth. The chamber was now filled with a deafening roar, the sound of something far larger than any man, far more ancient than any living creature. For a moment, everything was a blur, flickering lights from their flashlights, shuffling footsteps, the pounding of their hearts, the screeching of the walls. They rushed back toward the passageway, but the walls themselves seemed to close in, as if trying to trap them within the tomb of the creature that had just been set free. "We can't get out!" Miller screamed, his voice filled with panic. "The walls are moving!" Jennings looked around desperately, trying to make sense of the madness, but all he could see was the growing shadow in the center of the room, the dim outlines of something massive and monstrous, too monstrous to describe. The ground beneath them groaned with an unnatural noise, a deep, grating sound, as the air became thick with an unsettling, suffocating presence. They had to leave. But the fort, no, the land itself, was turning against them. The walls were shifting. The very foundation of the place was collapsing, as if it was trying to prevent them from escaping. The creature's power was warping the reality around them, distorting the space, warping time. "Move, move, move!" Jennings shouted, pushing forward, grabbing Miller's arm and pulling him toward the nearest exit. But even as they ran, even as their breath came in shallow gasps, they knew they weren't alone. The hum had returned, the whispers growing louder, filling their ears with words they couldn't comprehend. They weren't just hearing the creature anymore. They were hearing everything. The soldiers who had died here, the ones trapped in the fog, the ghosts of every failed battalion, their voices merging into a chaotic, maddening sound. Something was wrong. As they sprinted through the hallways of the fort, the ground beneath them suddenly cracked open again, sending a shockwave of terror through their bodies. The walls seemed to shift, the fort's structure warping as if it were alive and aware. The air was thick with the scent of rot, as if the very fort was decaying in front of them. "We're never going to make it," Harrison cried out, his voice cracking with fear. "Yes, we will," Jennings roared, his adrenaline pumping through him. But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure. The further they ran, the more the passageways seemed to twist and turn, like a labyrinth meant to confuse them. And behind them, the monster grew stronger, its presence filling the space around them, threatening to consume everything. The light from their flashlights flickered wildly, casting long shadows on the walls. Every corner they turned, every step they took, felt like they were being herded deeper into the maze. The creature was close. It was following them. And then, there it was, a massive shape looming at the end of the hallway. At first, it appeared to be another soldier, another figure from the past. But as it came into view, they saw it for what it truly was. One of the lost souls. But it was no longer human. Its body was twisted, its face contorted into a grotesque mask of agony and rage. It was moving towards them, dragging its broken body across the floor, its limbs snapping and twitching like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. And behind it, the shadows seemed to multiply, growing darker, more insistent. "Run!" Jennings yelled, pushing the others forward, but as they moved, the shadows closed in around them. The air grew thick, suffocating. They couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The whispers were deafening now, the voices of the lost soldiers pressing against their minds, pushing them toward madness. They reached the door, or at least they thought they did. When they pushed against it, it didn't budge. The door was locked, and it wasn't just locked in the traditional sense. The walls around it had sealed themselves. The door was part of the fort, part of the curse that had been set in place, and the evil that had been unleashed had made sure they couldn't escape. "No, we can't be trapped here," Hall screamed, banging his fist against the door, his face twisted in panic. But there was no escape. Not through the door, not through the walls, not through any means they had at their disposal. "Don't lose control," Jennings said, trying to steady his breath, trying to think through the panic rising in his chest. "We need to think. We need to find the way out. There's still a way, but it's not through brute force. The land itself has to allow us to leave." Private Walker's eyes were wide with terror. "How do we make it allow us? The curse. It's not just something we can fight, it's—" The walls around them trembled violently, shaking with an unnatural energy. And then, the ground beneath them split wide open again, the door shuddering with a terrible force, the air crackling with electricity. It was coming. The creature, the force that had been sealed away for centuries, was no longer confined to the chamber. It was spilling out, flooding the hallways, filling the very air with its presence. Jennings knew one thing. They couldn't stay here any longer. The creature had learned to adapt, to manipulate the very fort that had once kept it locked away. "Now!" Jennings shouted. "We have to find a way out now!" But as they ran, as they fled deeper into the bowels of the fort, the creature's form, its massive shadow, began to take shape in front of them. They weren't going to escape, not unless they found the true source of the curse. And that meant going deeper into the abyss. The earth groaned beneath their feet as though the entire fort was coming alive, shaking in agony. The creature, whatever it was, whatever had been trapped in the bowels of this cursed land, was no longer just a presence lurking in the shadows. It was here. It was real. And it was hunting them. Jennings led the way, pushing through the growing darkness that seemed to close in from all sides. The air felt heavier with every step, thick with the taste of ash and decay. It wasn't just the walls that were shifting now, it was the land itself, pulling them further into its grip. "There has to be a way out of here," Hall muttered, his voice barely audible over the distant rumblings that filled the fort. He was right to be desperate. They had all seen the creature, heard the whispers, and felt the chilling presence that followed them like a shadow. But now they were running out of time. Jennings moved faster, urging the others to keep pace, but his mind was racing. There has to be something we missed, some final clue, some last piece of evidence hidden in this forsaken place. They couldn't escape until they found it. They couldn't survive unless they understood what had truly happened here. "There's one place we haven't checked," Jennings said, his voice strained but resolute. "The deepest part of the fort, the place where the rituals took place." The others exchanged uneasy glances. They had already seen too much, too many signs of the curse's power, too many ghosts of the past. But if there was any hope of ending this madness, they had no choice. They had to face whatever remained hidden in that dark corner of the fort. They followed Jennings through a narrow passageway, the walls closing in on them as the flickering light of their flashlights danced wildly, casting ghostly shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The whispers grew louder, more insistent now, echoing in their minds, drowning out their thoughts. The farther they went, the more the air felt alive, pulsing, breathing, as if the fort itself were a living entity. The temperature dropped again, the cold biting into their skin, a relentless chill that seemed to seep into their bones. And then they reached it. A massive stone door stood before them, ancient and weathered. The markings on it were familiar. Strange symbols and runes that had appeared on the map, in the journal, in the chamber with the altar. This was where it had all begun. This was the heart of the curse, the point where the Hellfire Battalion had made their final stand. "This is it," Jennings whispered, "the last place they sealed it away." His hand trembled as he reached for the door's handle. For a moment, it felt like the entire fort held its breath. The whispers in the air were louder now, urgent, as though whatever had been sealed inside was aware of their presence. But Jennings pushed forward, determined to uncover the truth. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a hidden chamber. It was vast, its ceiling high and vaulted, the walls adorned with ancient carvings that seemed to tell a story, one that no man could understand. The air was thick with the scent of something decayed, the remnants of forgotten rituals lingering in the atmosphere. And in the center of the room, surrounded by intricate symbols etched into the stone floor, was a large, ornate chest. It was covered in dust, untouched for centuries, but something about it drew them in. Something about it called to them. Jennings stepped forward, his breath shallow as he approached the chest. The others followed, their eyes wide with anticipation but also dread. This was it. The final secret. The one thing they needed to understand to stop the horror that had been unleashed. As Jennings reached out to open the chest, he hesitated. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, could feel the cursed land watching them, waiting for them to make the wrong move. "Be careful," Hall whispered, his voice thick with fear. Jennings nodded, but he had no choice. They needed the answers. They needed to know what the Hellfire Battalion had left behind. With a deep breath, he opened the chest. Inside, there was a book, old, worn, its cover cracked and frayed with age. The pages inside were yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. Jennings carefully lifted the book out, his hands trembling. As he opened it, the first page revealed a simple drawing, a map of the land, the fort, the surrounding areas. But something about it was different. It wasn't just a map. It was a ritual, a set of instructions, a way to trap the creature. "This is it," Jennings whispered. "This is the final step." The others crowded around him, looking over his shoulder at the ancient pages. The ritual was outlined in detail, how the Hellfire Battalion had been tasked with binding the creature to the land, keeping it contained. The ritual involved symbols, sacrifices, and the sealing of the creature's power into the earth itself. But there was one part of the ritual that stood out, a final instruction. If the seal ever begins to break, the bearer of the curse must offer themselves as the final sacrifice. Only then will the creature be fully bound, forever sealed away. Jennings's heart pounded in his chest as he read the words. The sacrifice. It had to be someone who was chosen to bear the curse, to contain the creature forever, and it was clear now. It had been him all along. He had always known this moment would come. He was the one who had been marked by the curse, the one who had been chosen by the ritual. But even as he read those words, a sickening realization began to creep into his mind. The ritual was not just about sealing the creature, it was about enduring it. The soldier who bore the curse would not only trap the creature in the earth, they would remain bound to it, trapped in this land for eternity, forever watching as the horrors continued to unfold. Jennings closed the book slowly, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just read. The creature, whatever it was bound to this place. But if the ritual failed, if the last sacrifice wasn't made, the land would never be free. The curse would never be broken. He looked up at the others, his face pale, haunted. This is it. This is how we stop it. But there's a price. The others looked at him, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. What do you mean? Miller asked, his voice trembling. Jennings swallowed hard. The ritual. It's me. I'm the one who has to be sacrificed. There was a long silence as the words sank in, the weight of what they meant hanging heavy in the air. The soldiers exchanged looks, but there was no time for doubt. The creature was coming for them. Are you sure? Hall asked, his voice hoarse. Jennings nodded, his eyes dark with the burden of knowledge. It's the only way. If the ritual fails. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew what would happen. Then let's make it count, Hall said, his voice filled with resolve. Jennings stepped forward, towards the center of the chamber, where the symbols still glowed faintly on the stone floor. The creature was already closing in, but they had one chance, one final chance to contain it. And it all came down to him. The weight of the room was unbearable. The chamber seemed to close in on Jennings, the walls pulsating with a strange energy as he stood at the center of the ritual's symbols. The book he held, the book of the final sacrifice, seemed to hum in his hands, its ancient pages vibrating with an energy that made the air thick, almost suffocating. The others were standing at a distance, watching him, their faces drawn with fear and confusion. The ritual was clear. They had uncovered the truth. But now the question was, could Jennings go through with it? Could he truly sacrifice himself to stop the terror that had been unleashed? Jennings! Hall's voice broke through the heavy silence. His words were full of uncertainty. There has to be another way. We've seen what that thing can do. You can't be the one to... Jennings cut him off with a grim look, his eyes locked onto the book. He had known this moment was coming. The weight of his own fate was clear now. It wasn't just about stopping the creature. It was about ending the curse that had plagued this land for centuries, the curse that had taken so many lives before him. "It's the only way, Hall," Jennings said, his voice steady but filled with the underlying strain of a man who had already accepted his fate. "This thing, this force, it's older than anything we can imagine. It's been waiting, and I've been the one to bear it, to finish what the Hellfire Battalion started." The room felt colder, and the shadows in the corners of the chamber seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The whispers from before had returned, louder now, louder than ever. It was as if the land itself was watching them, waiting to see what Jennings would do. The creature was close. He could feel its presence, its eyes fixed on him, as if it knew this was the moment of reckoning. "No," Walker whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "We can't let you do this. We can't just stand here and watch you." "Don't fight it, Walker," Jennings said, his voice more firm now. He turned to face his comrades, his soldiers, the men who had stood by him, fought beside him. His eyes softened just for a moment. "This is the only way. If I don't do this, if I don't finish it, everything, everyone, is lost. The creature will spread. It will break free of the land, and there will be no stopping it." Jennings felt his body start to shake as the reality of what he had to do began to settle in. He had never wanted this. He had never wanted to be the one who bore the burden of this curse. But in the end, the Hellfire Battalion had been made for this very moment. He had been chosen unwillingly to end it. And so he stepped into the center of the ritual's symbols, the ancient markings on the floor glowing faintly beneath his feet. The book in his hands felt heavier now, its pages turning on their own, as if it too knew the ritual was about to begin. The walls of the chamber seemed to vibrate with energy, the air thickening as the whispers grew louder until they drowned out all rational thought. It was as if the very land itself was calling out, beckoning the creature to return. Jennings closed his eyes, focusing on the ritual as the words from the journal echoed in his mind. "Only through sacrifice, only through the bearer of the curse will the creature be bound again." His voice faltered as he began to speak the incantation, the ancient words flowing from his lips like they were written into his soul. The words felt foreign, yet somehow familiar, as if they had been with him all his life, hidden beneath layers of memories he had long since forgotten. And as the last word escaped his lips, the entire chamber seemed to shudder. The floor cracked beneath him, the symbols on the stone glowing brighter than ever, as a low, deafening roar filled the room. The creature was responding. It was fighting against the ritual, fighting to break free, to claim the land as its own. The walls of the chamber began to crumble, dust falling from the ceiling like an omen of the end. But Jennings didn't waver. He stood tall, rooted to the spot, as the energy around him surged. He could feel the curse within him, its dark power threatening to consume him. It was painful. More painful than anything he had ever felt in his life. And then, just as he thought he might collapse, he felt it. The change. The air around him shifted. It was as if the earth was pulling the curse back into itself, sealing the creature, pulling it into the depths from where it came. The ground trembled, the chamber shaking violently as the walls cracked apart, the ceiling threatening to collapse. But Jennings stood firm. The whispers stopped. The creature's roar faded. The darkness that had filled the room began to dissipate, fading into nothingness. And then, silence. For the first time since the battle had begun, the air in the chamber felt still. The oppressive weight that had hung over them lifted. The creature was sealed once again, bound, trapped beneath the land, never to rise again. Jennings took a deep breath, his body sagging with exhaustion. The curse, the creature had been sealed. But at what cost? The others stood in stunned silence, their eyes wide as they slowly began to comprehend what had just happened. The land was still. The curse had been stopped. But Jennings collapsed to his knees, his body shaking with the toll of the ritual. His breath was labored, his skin cold and clammy, but he had done it. The creature was trapped. The land would finally be at peace. But at what cost? He could feel it, the pull of the curse, still clinging to him. He had fulfilled the ritual, he had sealed the creature away, but now he was bound to it. He was the last keeper of the curse, forever tied to the land. "You did it," Hall said softly, his voice filled with awe and sorrow. "You stopped it." Jennings looked up, his face pale, his body trembling with the weight of his sacrifice. "The curse is contained," he whispered. "But I am the last of the Hellfire Battalion, the last of the cursed." He looked down at the book in his hands, the last piece of the ritual, and then glanced up at the others, his eyes filled with a quiet acceptance. "I am bound to this land," he said, his voice heavy. "Just like the soldiers before me. The curse will never leave, but it will never rise again." The air around them felt lighter now, as if the weight of centuries had finally been lifted. The land was still, silent. But Jennings knew, in his heart, that it would never truly be at peace, because the Hellfire Battalion would always remain, forever guarding the land, forever guarding the curse. The silence in the chamber was deafening. The ground had stopped shaking, the rumbling of the earth slowly fading into the eerie stillness that now gripped the fort. Jennings could feel it in his bones, the weight of the curse now fully manifested in him as it settled deep within his chest. It was a presence he could no longer escape. As the dust settled and the last echoes of the ritual dissipated, the soldiers stood in stunned silence around him. The reality of what had just transpired was sinking in, but no one dared to speak. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of finality. The creature, the entity, was sealed. The land was, for now, at peace. But at the same time, they all knew something had changed, something irreversible. "Jennings," Hall's voice broke the silence, hoarse with disbelief. "You did it. You stopped it." Jennings lifted his head, his face pale, sweat dripping from his forehead. His eyes were hollow, the weight of his actions pulling him down. The truth hung between them, thick and suffocating. He had sealed the creature away, but it wasn't gone. It had just been bound, trapped beneath the earth as it had been for centuries. But now he was the keeper. "I did it," Jennings said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. He looked down at the book in his hands, the ritual's final words still burning in his mind. "I stopped it. For now." "Now?" Miller asked, his eyes filled with fear. "What do you mean, for now?" Jennings closed his eyes, his hand trembling as he placed the book on the ground. "The curse is contained, but it's not gone. I've bound it to the land, but I'm bound to it too. There's no leaving, no escaping." The soldiers stared at him, confusion and disbelief painted across their faces. "What are you talking about?" Hall demanded. "You stopped it. The creature is sealed. What more is there?" Jennings took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort. "It's not just about stopping the creature," he said, his voice breaking. "The Hellfire Battalion wasn't just a military unit. We weren't sent here to fight an enemy. We were sent to stop something far older, something that would never truly die." He paused, his gaze shifting to the crumbling walls of the fort. The symbols still faintly glowed, the energy of the ritual still lingering in the air. The battalion's purpose was to seal the curse, but it was a curse that could never be truly destroyed, only contained. The keeper, the one who performs the final sacrifice, becomes part of the curse. The soldiers looked at each other, their faces filled with dread. "You're saying you're the keeper now?" Walker asked, his voice trembling. Jennings nodded, his expression filled with sorrow. "Yes, I'm bound to the land. The curse will never leave me. I'm the last of the Hellfire Battalion, the final guardian." The truth hit them like a wave of ice-cold water. They had thought they were done. They had thought the battle was over. But now, standing in the aftermath, they realized that what Jennings had done, what he had sacrificed, was not a victory. It was a prison. "What does that mean?" Hall asked, his voice full of terror. "What are we supposed to do now?" Jennings' gaze fell to the ground, his fingers tightening around the book. "It means I'll never be free, and neither will the land. The creature is sealed, yes, but I will never escape it. The curse has claimed me." He lifted his eyes, looking at each of them in turn. "I've done what I was supposed to do. I've bound the creature. But the battle, the war, it never ends. It will never end. The Hellfire Battalion was always meant to be a sacrifice. The battalion is gone, but I remain. Forever." The soldiers stood in stunned silence, the weight of what Jennings had just said crashing down on them. It wasn't just the creature they had to worry about. It was the curse itself, and the price that Jennings had paid. The land had been cleansed, but at a terrible cost. As the realization sank in, a new wave of terror surged through the group. They hadn't just faced a creature from the depths of history. They hadn't just fought to survive. They had witnessed the truth of the Hellfire Battalion, the truth of the curse that had been passed down through generations, one soldier after another. "Jennings," Hall said, his voice filled with sorrow and fear. "You're telling us that you're stuck here? That you're bound to the land? That we can't help you?" Jennings nodded, his eyes filled with a haunting understanding. "This is the last battalion. We were the final line of defense. But the cost was always this. I'll remain here. I'll never leave. The creature will never be free again, but I'll be its keeper. For as long as the land endures." A cold wind swept through the chamber, the fog outside creeping back into the fort, swirling like a living thing. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the whispers returning once more, faint but insistent, like the voices of the long-dead soldiers who had come before. The air thickened with a tension that none of them could shake. The truth was too much to bear. But there was nothing they could do to change it. Jennings had completed the ritual. He had sealed the curse. But he had also become it. And the land, this land, would never truly know peace. Not until the last of the Hellfire Battalion was gone. And even then, the echoes of the past would remain. Jennings turned toward the others, his face pale, but his voice steady. "You can leave. You should leave. You have your lives ahead of you. I'm the last one here, but the land will always call to you. Always." The soldiers didn't move. They couldn't. They had seen too much, felt too much. The truth had been uncovered, but the curse was far from over. It would remain in their minds, in their souls, just as it would remain in Jennings, forever bound to the land he had fought to protect. "We can't leave you here," Miller said, his voice breaking. Go," Jennings interrupted, his tone firm but filled with sadness. "It's the only way. The curse is contained. The land will be at peace, for now. But I can't leave. This is my burden now. The last sacrifice." The soldiers stood motionless, caught between the overwhelming truth of what had happened and the horrifying reality of what Jennings had become. The creature was sealed, yes, but the curse had not been lifted. It had simply been passed on. Jennings turned away from them, his eyes filled with a quiet acceptance. The Hellfire Battalion is no more, and now I will remain here, the keeper of the curse. As the soldiers turned to leave, the chamber began to grow darker, the whispers of the past rising around them. The curse had been sealed, but its shadow would always loom over them, haunting them wherever they went. And as they stepped out into the fog, the weight of the battle they had fought, of the price they had paid, hung heavy in the air. The Hellfire Battalion was gone. But its story, its curse, would never be forgotten. The fort stood in silence as the soldiers left, their footsteps barely audible against the thick fog that now clung to the land. They had seen it all, the horror, the truth, and the cost of the battle they had fought. But they couldn't stay. They couldn't linger, knowing what Jennings had become. As they moved farther from the fort, the oppressive weight that had clung to them began to lift. The air felt strangely lighter, as if the land had exhaled a long-held breath. But it wasn't true peace. They knew that. They could still feel it. The curse. It had been sealed, yes, but the land would never truly know peace as long as the echoes of the Hellfire Battalion lingered. Jennings remained in the chamber, the last soldier, the last keeper of the curse. His body had collapsed, exhausted by the ritual, but his spirit, it remained tethered to the land, bound to the earth he had sworn to protect. He was the final sacrifice, the one who had paid the ultimate price. And now, his existence would be entwined with the curse for eternity. But even as the others walked away, their thoughts heavy with the burden of what they had learned, they couldn't help but wonder. Was it over? Was the curse truly sealed? Or was this just the beginning of something darker? The land was quiet now. Too quiet. Back at the edge of the forest, where the fort's crumbling walls faded behind them, the soldiers came to a halt. "No one will ever know," Walker said, his voice a quiet murmur. His eyes were distant, filled with the weight of the past few days. What really happened here? The truth. It'll be buried with us. Hall glanced at him, his face grim. Maybe it's better that way. No one would believe it anyway. And maybe that's the way it should stay. But Jennings' words, his last ones, still echoed in their minds. The curse is contained, but I am bound to it, and so is the land. It will never rest. The fog began to lift as they walked away, but the heavy atmosphere lingered in their souls. Even as the world around them seemed to go back to normal, something inside them had changed. They had seen the unexplainable. They had faced the unspeakable. And they had learned the truth, that some forces were never meant to be understood, that some curses were never meant to be broken. For a while, they walked in silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on them like a stone. They had escaped. They had survived. But the shadow of the Hellfire Battalion, the weight of the curse, would haunt them forever. They had thought that once they left the fort, once they walked away from Jennings, it would be over. But the more they walked, the more they realized the truth. They couldn't escape it. Not really. Because the curse was a part of them now. It lived in their bones, in the dark corners of their minds, in the whispers that followed them wherever they went. "Do you think it's really over?" Miller asked, his voice barely audible as he looked over his shoulder, back toward the fort. "I don't know," Hall answered quietly. "But whatever we faced, whatever he faced, it's not something anyone should ever have to carry, not for eternity." They kept walking, each lost in their thoughts, the weight of the past pressing heavily on them. But no matter how far they traveled, the echoes of that cursed land would never truly leave them. Back at the fort, the night fell in silence, but something still moved within the walls. Jennings stood, unmoving in the center of the ritual's symbols. His body had collapsed with exhaustion, but his spirit, his cursed soul, remained tethered to the land. The ritual had bound him to it, but it had not freed him. The air around him seemed to vibrate with a dark energy. His mind was still, quiet, but his eyes, though empty, seemed to see beyond the veil of the world. The creature, the force that had been sealed away, was gone for now. But Jennings knew, deep in, his soul, that the cycle would repeat. The land would always call for a new keeper. The Hellfire Battalion would always return, always bound to the earth. He could feel it, the weight of eternity. His body was nothing more than a vessel now, a tool used to contain the curse. He was trapped. But in that isolation he found something else. Peace. For even though he could never leave, he had fulfilled his purpose. The creature would not rise again. It was sealed, for now. But as the moon rose high above the land, casting its pale light across the fort, Jennings whispered to the night, his voice barely more than a breath. "Is this really it? Is this the end of the battalion? Or will another come to take my place?" The whispers of the past, of soldiers long gone, of those who had faced the curse before him, answered him. The truth was clear. The cycle never ended. And as the fog began to swirl around the fort, as the land settled into its uneasy sleep, Jennings knew this truth. The Hellfire Battalion had never been just a group of soldiers. It was a legacy that would continue long after the last soldier had fallen. Jennings had sealed the creature. He had sacrificed himself. But the land would never be free. The fort was silent once again. But as the years passed, the whispers would continue. The ghosts of the battalion would always walk the land, waiting for the next soldier, the next victim, to take up the mantle. And the land, cursed for eternity, would remain a place of nightmares, a place where time and death had no power. Because the Hellfire Battalion would never truly be gone. It would live on forever,